Namaste and other nonsense. Chapter 1. The Ambush. The brochure was glossy. That was the first warning sign. Gerald Fitch had lived 63 years on this earth, and had learned to distrust anything that arrived in the post looking that pleased with itself. Glossy brochures meant timeshares in Lanzarote, or insurance policies with 17 exclusion clauses, or, apparently, something called Clearwater Pines Wellness and Restoration Retreat, which promised. He squinted at the text. A transformative journey toward wholeness, rooted in ancient wisdom and modern healing practices. He set it on the kitchen table next to his cup of tea and stared at it. "I'm not going," he said. His daughter, Lauren, had her mother's gift for ignoring inconvenient statements. She was 31, a yoga teacher and part-time nutritional therapist, and she had recently discovered the word somatic, which she used constantly and with great confidence. She was refilling the kettle with the serene efficiency of someone who had already won an argument, and was just waiting for the other party to catch up. "Dad, you haven't been sleeping. You barely leave the flat. You've watched the entire back catalogue of Top Gear 3 times." "I enjoy Top Gear. The original run, yes. But you're now on the specials." Gerald wrapped both hands around his mug. Outside, a grey October sky pressed down on Coventry with the cheerful determination of a damp flannel. He was, he supposed, aware that things had not been entirely brilliant since the redundancy. 18 months was long enough to notice a pattern. But noticing a pattern was different from flying to the Lake District to do whatever it was people did at places called Clearwater Pines. "What do they even mean by restoration?" he asked, holding up the brochure with 2 fingers, as though it might be contagious. "Restoration of what, exactly? I'm not a Georgian townhouse." Lauren sat down across from him. She had the careful expression she'd been wearing a lot lately. The one that combined love and concern in proportions that made Gerald feel like a patient being gently informed of his prognosis. "It's 5 days," she said. "There's a lake. Walking. Some group sessions." Group sessions. He repeated this as one might repeat the phrase minor surgical procedure. Technically benign, clearly not. "Talking. With people who've been through similar things. I haven't been through anything. I've been made redundant. It happens to millions of people. It's not." He searched for the correct register of dismissiveness. "It's not a thing." Lauren reached across the table and put her hand over his, which he found disarming and slightly infuriating. "Dad. You were at Hargreaves & Son for 31 years. You were the deputy general manager. You knew everybody's birthday. You brought in a Christmas tree every year on your own, in your car, with the windows down because it was too tall to fit any other way." Gerald said nothing. "And then one day they gave you a card signed by people you'd never met. A bottle of Johnny Walker Black Label, and a P45. And you haven't talked about it once. Not once." A pigeon landed on the windowsill, regarded the scene with one orange eye, and left. "I talk," Gerald said. "You say, 'Fine,' and 'can't complain,' and then change the subject to whether they're going to sort out the roundabout on the ring road." He considered this. It was, he admitted to himself, broadly accurate. "I'm not doing that." He glanced at the brochure again. "The sound bath. Whatever that is. It sounds like something that should come with a warning label. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do. Is that genuinely true, or is that one of those things people say?" Lauren smiled in a way that was not entirely reassuring. "There's also very good food. Farm to table. And proper beds." Gerald looked at his tea. He looked at the brochure. He looked out at the Coventry sky, which had decided, in solidarity, to make itself even less appealing. "I'm bringing my own biscuits," he said. Chapter 2. Arrivals. Clearwater Pines sat in a shallow valley in Cumbria, reached by a single-lane road that wound between dry stone walls with what Gerald considered excessive drama. The taxi driver had been cheerful in the relentless way of people who are paid to be, and had mentioned stunning views 4 times in 40 minutes, despite the fact that a thick, low cloud had erased the landscape completely, and they might, for all Gerald knew, have been driving through a car park in Wolverhampton. The building itself was a converted farmhouse, extended sympathetically, its stone walls the color of old oatmeal. A hand-lettered sign read, "Welcome to Clearwater Pines, please arrive as you are." "As I am," Gerald muttered to himself, pulling his weedy case up the flagstone path. "Is someone who would prefer to be at home?" The welcome was administered by a young woman named Jess, who had 3 ear piercings and a smile that was, despite Gerald's best efforts, difficult to dislike. She gave him a small linen bag containing a room key, a weekly schedule printed on recycled paper, and a smooth stone. "What's this?" he asked, holding up the stone. "A grounding stone. Some guests find it helpful to hold it when they're feeling anxious or..." "I'm not anxious." "Of course." Jess made a small note on her clipboard. "It's also just a nice stone." Gerald put it in his pocket. His room was, he grudgingly acknowledged, rather lovely. Whitewashed walls, a window seat overlooking a garden that disappeared into fog, a bed that appeared to have been assembled from pure clouds by people with a fanatical commitment to thread count. He sat on it experimentally. He sat on it for quite a while. He was unpacking his biscuits. 2 packets of rich tea and a half-eaten sleeve of hobnobs. Into the bedside drawer when someone knocked at his door. The man in the corridor was around Gerald's age, perhaps a year or 2 older, with a wide, ruddy face and white hair cropped close to his skull. He was wearing a fleece that had seen considerable action, and holding a mug that said "World's Okayest Golfer." "You the new one?" the man said. "I suppose I am," Gerald said. "Barry." He extended a hand. His handshake was decisive. "Arrived Monday. They've got me doing something called forest bathing this afternoon. I want you to know that nobody is getting in a bath in a forest, not on my watch. I've already checked." Gerald felt the first stirring of something he hadn't felt in some time. It might have been cautious optimism. "Gerald," he said. "What did they get you on?" "My son." "You?" "My daughter." Barry shook his head with the philosophical sadness of a man confirming a widely held suspicion. "Classic. Do you play chess?" "I do." "Good. They've got a set in the common room. I've been waiting for someone sensible to arrive." He looked past Gerald at the bedside table. "Are those hobnobs?" "They are. I've only had oat clusters since Monday. I may weep." Gerald opened the drawer. "Come in," he said. "We'll have a debrief." The group assembled for the first session that evening, in a room that the schedule called the gathering space. A large, warm room with low lighting, mismatched armchairs, and a wood-burning stove that filled the air with the kind of smell that made even Gerald briefly forget he hadn't wanted to come. There were 6 of them, plus the facilitator. A calm, compact woman in her 50s named Helen, with reading glasses pushed up onto her head, and the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades listening to people, and had never once needed to fill a silence. Gerald did a quick assessment of his fellow retreatants, as he always assessed new environments, the habit of 31 years in supply chain management making itself useful. There was Barry, who Gerald had already identified as an ally. There was Pauline, a tall Glaswegian woman in her early 60s with short silver hair, and a lanyard that said, "Retired NHS," that she had not yet removed, either from habit or as a statement of identity. There was Desmond, who was black, elegantly dressed even in a casual jumper, and who had an engineer's precision to the way he spoke. There was Trish, who was 58, Welsh, and had brought a canvas tote bag with "This is fine" printed on it alongside the famous cartoon dog, which Gerald thought showed rather admirable self-awareness. And finally there was Keith, a slight, quietly anxious man from Norwich who had arrived with 4 books, and immediately arranged them on his bedside table in height order. Helen asked them each, simply, why they'd come. Gerald had prepared a brief, factual account. He delivered it. Daughter's idea seemed harmless enough, perfectly fine really, just thought he'd see what it was all about. 5 sentences. Clean and efficient. Helen nodded in the way of someone who had heard this particular speech many times, and held it with great care regardless. Barry said his son had been concerned because Barry had maybe gone a bit quiet since taking early retirement from the fire service 18 months ago. The word maybe is doing a lot of work in that sentence, Pauline observed. Fair enough, Barry said. Pauline herself had retired after 36 years as a district nurse. She'd been fine, she explained, absolutely fine, and then she had stood in a supermarket for 25 minutes, unable to decide whether to buy semi-skimmed or full-fat milk, and had sat down on the floor of the dairy aisle and cried. Her daughter had found her a fortnight later, still standing in the kitchen staring out of the window. Hence, here. I wasn't staring, Pauline added. I was thinking. What were you thinking about? Helen asked. A beat. Nothing, Pauline admitted. Desmond, it emerged, had been a civil engineer for 34 years, and had been pushed out at 61, in what his company had described as a strategic restructure, and what Desmond described as the sort of thing that happens when they want someone younger and cheaper and don't have the decency to say so outright. He had been given a redundancy package sufficient to fund a comfortable retirement. He had not been comfortable. Keith had spent 22 years as a secondary school librarian, and the library had been decommissioned. This was the word he used. Decommissioned. And it produced a brief, loaded silence, after which Helen said, simply, "That's a significant loss." And Keith blinked several times behind his glasses. Trish had run her own independent travel agency for 27 years. Lockdown, then the internet, then more lockdown. It wasn't really the money, she said. We managed. It's just. I knew where everyone was going on holiday. I knew their children's names. I knew who was nervous about flying and who needed an aisle seat. And then there was just nothing. The wood burner popped and settled. Gerald looked around the room at these people. Retired, restructured, decommissioned, dissolved. And had the peculiar sensation of recognizing something he hadn't known he was looking for. They were, he thought, a lost and found department. Stacked neatly by the door. Waiting. He put his hand in his pocket and found the smooth stone. Chapter 3. The program. And what Gerald made of it. The days at Clearwater Pines had a shape to them that Gerald initially resisted, and then, without entirely meaning to, began to appreciate. Mornings began with optional sunrise yoga on the lawn, which Gerald attended once, found cold, and declined thereafter without guilt. There was a guided walk after breakfast. The hills were extraordinary once the fog lifted, great shoulders of fell dropping into blue-grey valleys. And a session with Helen in the afternoons. Evenings were free, structured around dinner and the common room, and whatever quiet pursuit each person chose. Gerald chose chess. Barry was a competent opponent and a good loser, which Gerald considered the rarest combination. Desmond turned out to play a ruthlessly strategic game, and beat Gerald twice in the first 3 days, which Gerald found objectionable but respectful. Keith Reed. Pauline and Trish had discovered a mutual love of extremely specific true crime documentaries, and watched them on Trish's laptop with the focused expression of women conducting a professional inquiry. They've got a sound bath on Thursday, Barry mentioned on the second evening, moving a bishop into what he appeared to believe was a commanding position. It wasn't. Have you looked into what that actually is? I'm told it's bowls, Gerald said. Tibetan singing bowls. Apparently the vibrations are meant to. He tried to remember Lauren's explanation. Promotes cellular resonance. Do you believe that? Gerald took Barry's bishop. I believe in cellular resonance about as much as I believe in homeopathy. However, I also once believed that taking a nap after lunch was for people without anything better to do, and now I think it's one of the top 5 innovations in human history. So I've become somewhat more open-minded in my later years. Barry stared at the board. You've absolutely destroyed me, haven't you? Several moves ago, yes. The sound bath, when it arrived on Thursday morning, was held in the largest room in the farmhouse, lit by winter sun through tall windows. They lay on mats with blankets and eye pillows while a young man named Callum, who had extremely long fingers and a composure that suggested he had never experienced a moment of stress in his entire life, positioned large bronze bowls around the room and began to play them. Gerald lay on his back and stared at the ceiling and waited to feel foolish. The sound moved through the room in waves. Low and resonant, overlapping, settling into the space between thoughts. Gerald was aware of Barry next to him, and could hear, faintly, what might have been Keith making a small, surprised sound. He did not, as he had half expected, feel transformed. But he felt still. The particular stillness of a room after everyone has left. He thought about the office, which he hadn't allowed himself to do properly. Not the building, but the specific texture of it. The particular angle of afternoon light through the second-floor windows in October. The smell of the photocopier warming up. The sound of footsteps he could identify by their weight and rhythm even from 3 rooms away. Terry from logistics, who always scuffed his left heel. Sarah from accounts, who took the stairs 2 at a time until she'd had her second coffee. His own office, which had been, he now acknowledged to himself, the size of a large broom cupboard, but which he had filled with 31 years of accumulated presence, until it felt like a room of his own. He lay in the sound bath and thought, I miss it. He had not said that to anyone. He had said fine and can't complain and made observations about the ring road. But in the quiet room with the bowls singing, he thought it, clearly and completely. I miss it. Afterward, on the way to lunch, Desmond fell into step beside him. Well, Desmond said. Yes. Gerald agreed. I thought it would feel silly. I know. They walked in companionable silence for a moment. I kept thinking about my last project. Desmond said, eventually. The Croston Bridge. I drove an hour out of my way to see it last autumn. Just to look at it. Didn't tell my wife. He paused. She would have thought it was perfectly reasonable, actually. Which makes it more embarrassing somehow. Gerald nodded. 34 years. Desmond said. You don't just stop. No. Gerald said. You don't. Chapter 4. The afternoon with Helen. The afternoon sessions with Helen were, Gerald had decided by Wednesday, the part of the program he had most vigorously pre-dismissed, and was now finding most useful. This irritated him, though he tried to experience the irritation with what he believed Lauren would call curious openness, a phrase he had previously considered pretentious and was now using as a sort of internal metric. Helen did not, to his relief, ask them to visualize their inner child or breathe in specific colors. She asked questions, and then listened in a way that suggested she regarded the answers as genuinely interesting. Which was, Gerald thought, the closest thing to a therapeutic superpower he could imagine. On Thursday afternoon, The day of the sound bath, she asked them to talk about what their careers had meant to them. Not what their jobs had been, but what they had meant. This produced a silence, then a hesitancy, then a slow unfurling that Gerald watched with the fascination of someone watching a time-lapse of a flower opening. Pauline said her job had meant she was someone people called in a crisis. When it was really bad. A diagnosis, a death, someone who'd been managing on their own and finally couldn't. They called me. And I came. She straightened slightly. That's not nothing. That's everything. Trish said quietly. Keith said the library had meant that children who had nothing in common could find a common language. I had a boy one year, dreadful home situation, barely spoke. Found him in the reference section every lunch break for 6 months reading about volcanoes. Then he started talking about volcanoes. Then he just started talking. He looked at his hands. I wonder about him sometimes. Trish said the travel agency had meant she was, for a lot of people, the person who made the best thing of the year happen. Weddings, anniversaries, once a man who'd never been on a plane at 72 because he'd always been too frightened. We took 2 months to sort it. Little letters back and forth, building up to it. She shook her head. He sent me a postcard from Corfu. I've still got it. Barry said the fire service had meant he slept at night, which got a laugh. But when it settled, he added, more quietly. I mean, genuinely. I've never had trouble sleeping in my life, and I always thought that was just the way I was built. And then I left and I couldn't sleep at all, and I realized it was because I'd always known, at the back of my mind, that if something happened, I knew what to do. I was prepared. And now I don't know what I'm prepared for. Desmond said engineering had meant proof. The bridge is there. You can see it. It holds weight. It doesn't need me to explain it or advocate for it or ask anyone to take it on faith. It exists. A pause. I find I miss that more than anything else. The proof. Then Helen turned to Gerald with the unhurried patience of someone with all the time in the world. Gerald? He looked around the room. At Barry's honest, open face. At Pauline with her lanyard still on. At Keith, who had probably alphabetized something while they were talking, just for comfort. At Trish's tote bag, the dog sitting in the fire, everything fine. He thought about what to say. He thought about the 5-sentence version, the fine and can't complain version. He said. I knew all the orders. Not the big ones. Anyone could tell you the big ones. The little ones. The standing orders that went out every 6 weeks to the same suppliers, the accounts that were tricky about invoicing, the driver who needed his route adjusted every December, because his mother was ill in Stoke and he needed to be able to get there on a Friday. 31 years of small things that I kept in my head because I thought. He stopped. What did you think? Helen said. I thought someone had to. I thought if I didn't remember them, they'd disappear. And then they made me redundant and they disappeared anyway. He was surprised to find that his voice had developed a quality he didn't recognize. The particular texture of something that has been held under pressure for a long time, and has recently been given a small outlet. He cleared his throat. They disappeared anyway. He said again. And I wasn't there. The room held this for a moment. You kept things running. Pauline said. That was the job. That's not just a job. She shook her head. You think the driver's mother in Stoke didn't matter? You think he didn't know why his route worked? Gerald, someone knew. You knew. It doesn't exist anymore. It existed. Desmond said simply. 31 years. That's not nothing. That's nearly everything. Gerald sat with this. The fire popped in the stove. Outside, through the tall window, A watery winter sun was making a genuine effort above the fells. He put his hand in his pocket. He found the stone. He thought. For the first time since the card and the bottle of Johnny Walker Black Label. Yes. Yes, it was. Nearly everything. Chapter 5. On the last day. The final morning arrived in one of those impossible, apologetic bursts of Cumbrian sunshine that seemed designed to make the departure worse. The lake caught the light and scattered it extravagantly. The mountains revealed themselves in full, purple and green and grey, with a slight self-important air of scenery that knows it's spectacular. Gerald went for a walk before breakfast without being asked, which surprised him. He walked the path around the lower fell, hands in his pockets, and watched a red kite quarter the sky above him, with the unhurried confidence of something that had never doubted its purpose. He thought about various things. He also did not think about various things, which was new, and which he suspected was the path that Lauren and Helen, and possibly the sound bowls had been gently working toward. He was back in the farmhouse garden by 8 o'clock, and found Desmond at the garden table with a cafetiere and 2 cups, in the manner of a man who had been expecting company. "I've been thinking," Desmond said, pouring without preamble. "Dangerous habit. I have a friend who runs an engineering mentorship program. Works with young people who want to go into infrastructure. They need someone to help with project management, systems, logistics." He passed Gerald a cup. "He mentioned it to me at a dinner 6 months ago, and I told him I was retired and that was that. I've been thinking about it since Monday." Gerald wrapped his hands around the cup. The stone was in his pocket, as it had been every day. He suspected he was going to take it home. He suspected this was, perhaps, the intended outcome, and he no longer found this annoying. "Are you going to ring him?" Gerald asked. "Yes." Desmond looked at the mountains. "I think what I realized in the session with Helen is that I wasn't actually resting. I was just sitting with the proof of all the things I'd done, and trying to tell myself that was enough. But it's not the same as doing. Do you understand what I mean?" "I understand exactly," Gerald said. "What about you?" Gerald considered. He had been considering since the previous afternoon. He was someone who had run logistics, who had kept things moving, who had held 31 years of small but necessary knowledge in his head. There was, he was aware, a community centre 3 streets from his flat, which ran a food bank every Thursday, and a lunch club for the elderly on Wednesdays, and which had been featured in the local paper, because their volunteer coordinator had retired, and they were struggling to manage the organization of it. He had read the article and thought, someone should sort that out. He had turned the page. He mentioned this to Desmond. "That sounds like you," Desmond said. "Does it? You know which drivers need their routes adjusted in December." "Of course it does." Gerald drank his coffee. The kite came back across the sky, or possibly a different kite, and he watched it go. At lunchtime, the 6 of them ate together at the long table in the farmhouse kitchen, with Jess and Helen and Callum the sound bath man, who turned out, once engaged in ordinary conversation, to be extremely funny about an incident involving a singing bowl and a startled cat. They ate very good bread and very good soup and talked in the relaxed, slightly elegiac way of people who had spent a week being more honest with each other than they generally were with anyone. Pauline had taken off the NHS lanyard the previous evening and left it in her room. She announced this as though it were a small and private ceremony, which Gerald suspected it was. Keith had spoken to his wife twice this week, proper conversations, and had mentioned the boy who liked volcanoes. His wife had apparently said, "Why haven't you told me that before?" Which was not a criticism but a real question, and Keith was still working out the answer. Trish had, somewhat to her own amazement, looked up a tourism consultancy that worked with independent businesses. I don't know if it's anything, she said. But it's looking. Barry had decided to train as a first aid instructor. I know what I'm prepared for, he said, with the simplicity of someone who had finally located a mislaid item. That's it. That's what I'm prepared for. After lunch, cases were wheeled out to the entrance hall, and taxis were ordered, and there was the slightly disorganized warmth of departures, phone numbers exchanged and intentions made. Barry shook Gerald's hand at the door. It was, again, decisive. Chess rematch, he said. I've been thinking about that, Bishop. You should have been thinking about it 3 moves earlier, Gerald told him. I know. That's what I've been thinking about. Gerald shared a taxi to the station with Pauline, who had a train to Glasgow, and who spent the journey asking him about the food bank volunteer coordinator role, with the professional focus of someone who had, for 36 years, assessed situations and determined what was needed. You could do that standing on your head, she said. I haven't confirmed I'm doing it. I know. But you could. He looked out at the Cumbrian countryside, which was doing its level best in the afternoon light, the fells receding behind them, dry stone walls threading through the valley like the seams of something sewn carefully together. He thought about the coordinator role. He thought about the driver and his mother in Stoke. He thought about the particular weight of 31 years. He took the stone out of his pocket and held it. 3 weeks later, Gerald rang Lauren on a Sunday morning, which he did not usually do. I've started at the community center, he said. Volunteer coordinator. It's Wednesday and Thursday mornings. A silence that contained, he suspected, some very carefully managed emotion. That's brilliant, Dad. It's fine, it's nothing dramatic. The whole system was a mess. 3 separate spreadsheets for the same delivery list. Nobody had labeled anything consistently. I've redone the whole intake log. Of course you have. They had 7 boxes of tinned tomatoes and no tin openers. 7 boxes. I've sourced 4 openers and written a procurement note. Dad. It's fine. I told you, it's nothing. Dad. He stopped. I know. He said. I know. He was looking out his kitchen window. The sky was doing something unremarkable, as Coventry skies generally did. A pigeon was on the windowsill. Or possibly the same pigeon, he supposed they were hard to distinguish. Regarding him with the one-eyed equanimity of something that had no strong feelings either way. On the windowsill, propped against the glass, was a smooth grey stone. I got a card from Barry, he said. He's started teaching first aid at the leisure centre. Says he's slept properly for the first time in 18 months. That's wonderful. Also, Gerald said. You were right. Another silence. Different quality. The kind you try not to disturb. About the retreat? About all of it. I'm not going to make a thing of saying so, you understand. I'm saying it once, clearly, and then we're moving on. Lauren made a sound that Gerald recognized from her childhood. Age 9, maybe 10. The specific sound of trying not to laugh and completely failing. He found it, as he always had, the best sound in the world. Noted. She said. Julie noted. Right. Said Gerald. Good. He looked at the stone. Now. Are you eating enough? Because you sounded peaky last week, and I've been reading about, Dad. I'm just saying. I know. Lauren said warmly, on the other end of the line in her flat in Birmingham, audibly smiling. I know you are. Outside, the pigeon considered the situation for another moment, arrived at no strong conclusions, and flew away. The sky remained as it was. Gerald held the stone in one hand and the phone in the other, and stood at the window of his kitchen, Which was, as it turned out, exactly where he was supposed to be.